The man known to history as Oskar Schindler was born on the 28th of April 1908 in the town of Zwickau, in the Moravia region of what was then the Empire of Austria-Hungary but is today the Czech Republic. His father was Johann Schindler, who went by the name of Hans and owned a farm machinery business. His mother was Franziska Schindler, née Lüse, a homemaker. She and Hans had one other child, a daughter named Elfriede, who was born in 1915. The Schindlers lived in a region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire known as the Sudetenland. Unlike most of the other parts of what would one day become the Czech Republic, this region was primarily inhabited by ethnic Sudeten Germans rather than Czechs. Thus, the Sudetenland was culturally closer to Germany than the world of Prague, which lay only a few hours away. Growing up, Schindler and all of his neighbors would have spoken German as their first language. Oskar had a tumultuous childhood in his early years here. His father was a heavy drinker and womanizer who engaged in extramarital affairs and was emotionally unstable. It was claimed that he had once raped his sister-in-law during a drunken episode, an incident which allegedly resulted in the birth of an illegitimate child, Oskar's half-sister, who appears to have died in her youth. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the relationship between father and son was antagonistic from early on. Oskar attended the local elementary and secondary schools. He was not exactly a dedicated student, but there is otherwise a frustrating lack of information about his childhood years, a gap which Schindler did not try to fill when interviewed in later years. While Oskar was growing up, events were occurring across Europe which would have huge consequences for the continent and indeed Schindler's own life path. They would also make him a national of a different country before he reached his teenage years. Ever since the 1870s, the great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, had been on a collision course with each other, fueled by colonial rivalry in the scramble for Africa, and nationalism and competition between Austria-Hungary and Russia to claim territory in the Balkans as the Ottoman Empire collapsed there. Eventually, in the summer of 1914, these simmering tensions exploded into war after a crisis between the Austro-Hungarian government and the Kingdom of Serbia in the Balkans ballooned out of control. In the early days of August, an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia went to war with Austria-Hungary and Germany, who were also allied with Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. The conflict would soon expand to become the First World War, as powers such as Japan and the United States eventually became involved. As they did, Germany and Austria-Hungary faced impossible odds, and eventually, in 1918, the war resulted in defeat for the two Central European powers. Even before the war ended, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was entering a crisis which would have profound implications for Schindler's homeland in the Sudetenland. As it became clear that the war effort was doomed in the late summer and early autumn of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was comprised of a wide array of different nationalities such as the Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Slovaks, and Serbs, began to fall apart. In October 1918, weeks before the First World War actually ended, Czech and Slovak separatists in the northern parts of the empire declared independence from Vienna, announcing the creation of a new independent state of Czechoslovakia. This included Schindler's native region, the Sudetenland, a territory which admittedly was comprised much more of ethnically German families like the Schindlers than either Czechs or Slovaks. The new Czechoslovak government was unclear how to proceed in the aftermath of the war regarding predominantly German parts of their new nation, like the Sudetenland, and asked the main victors in the war, Britain, France, and the US, to adjudicate on the matter during the peace negotiations at Versailles, outside Paris, in 1919. The general consensus here was that both Germany and Austria should be weakened as much as possible in the aftermath of the war. Thus, the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which covered the post-war settlement in the lands of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, decreed that the Sudetenland would remain a part of the newly formed state of Czechoslovakia. Consequently, Schindler grew up from 1918 onwards as a citizen of this new state. The issue of the Sudetenland, though, would emerge again soon. After just about making his way through secondary school in the early 1920s, Schindler went on to a technical school. However, he was expelled from here in 1924, shortly after his arrival, for forging his grade report. Eventually, he was allowed back, though henceforth he was referred to by his classmates as Schindler the Crook. This was not the only issue of criminality which he confronted around this time. In 1925, Hans Schindler, who sold insurance premiums as a side job to make extra money, was accused by some of his customers of embezzling money from them. Hans, in turn, blamed his son for the crime, though many years later, Oscar's wife would claim that Hans had himself been responsible. Whoever the culprit was, it resulted in further legal difficulties for Oscar when he was still shy of his 18th birthday. However, he was soon allowed to return to the technical college he had been expelled from which he managed to graduate. Following this, he headed to Brno, a large Czech town, where he took several courses on machinery, chauffeuring, and the repair and maintenance of heaters. He passed exams for these, paving the way to work in the family business. Oscar met his future wife in the autumn of 1927. Emily "Millie" Pelzel was 7 months older than Oscar and from the village of Stare Maletin, about 40 kilometers from Zwickau. Her father was a prosperous farmer, and the Pelzels had a harmonious family life, in contrast to that of the Schindlers. The occasion of their first encounter was when Oscar, who had been working for his father's business on and off since 1924, had arrived to the Pelzel farm on business and tried to sell Emily's father an electric generator for their house. Oscar was apparently infatuated with Emily upon first meeting her and continued to visit the Pelzel farm thereafter, inventing reasons to do so about farm machinery and the like, but in reality in search of opportunities to woo Emily. It worked, and after several weeks of this, she accepted his marriage proposal. They were wed on the 6th of March 1928, but from the offset, it was a problematic union. The newlyweds moved into the Schindler house, occupying the upstairs, but Hans Schindler's heavy drinking and crude behavior proved problematic. It was the beginning of a marriage that would have many peaks and valleys over the next 30 years. The years that followed did not bring much better. Oscar had received a considerable dowry from Emily's father when they married, but he then spent much of this in a somewhat reckless fashion in 1928, indulging his desire to become a race car driver. This enterprise faltered after just a few months, with the loss of much of their savings. Thereafter, he quit working for his father and took a job with the Moravian Electric Company in Brno. But this soon fell through as well, and instead, he opened a racing school. Again, this was interrupted by an 18-month stint in the Czechoslovak army, where he served in the 10th Infantry Regiment, eventually rising to the rank of Lance Corporal. However, in the climate of the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was little prospect of Czechoslovakia ending up at war, and Oscar later noted that his time as a conscript was filled more with recreational activities than any real soldiering. When his time of service was done, he returned to working with the Moravian Electric Company, but hard times were hitting Europe economically in the 1930s, and the company soon shut down. In this environment, Emily began to criticize Oscar for having squandered the money he had received from her father when they married in 1928. There was, though, a growing problem of another kind. Oscar had inherited his father's liking for alcohol. This had been something of an issue from the early days of his marriage to Emily, but it became increasingly problematic during the early 1930s. Once he found himself out of work and at a loose end. He was arrested twice in 1931 and 1932 for public drunkenness, and was imprisoned on one of these occasions for 24 hours before being fined and released. However, this early experience of detention did not deter him, and Oscar was arrested 2 more times before the end of 1932. Eventually, he was sentenced to 4 days in prison and fined 200 crowns, a not insignificant sum for a couple down on their luck financially and a man who was out of work. Things improved moderately from that point on. But it would not be his last brush with the law, and his increasing alcoholism continued unabated, albeit with fewer run-ins with the police. If it became more controlled over time, it was because later in 1932, Oskar did find a new job with the Yaroslav Simek Bank in Prague. He would work there for 6 years, and he and Emily moved into a large house shortly after he acquired the job, one which she later described as a mansion compared with the old Schindler house. There were further problems waiting during this period. At some stage in the early 1930s, Oskar, who had also acquired his father's womanizing ways, began having an affair with a woman called Aurelie Schlegel, whom he had known since his childhood and who had worked as a secretary for Hans Schindler. 2 illegitimate children were soon born, Edith and Oskar Jr. Emily, with whom Oskar never had any children, was seemingly fully aware of the affair after a certain point and of the children born out of wedlock. Oskar was a neglectful parent, in part perhaps because he may have doubted that he was actually Edith and Oskar Jr.'s father to begin with. One might ask at this point why Emily stayed with him in what were already rocky first years to their marriage. She later stated that, in spite of his flaws, Oskar had a big heart and was always ready to help whoever was in need. He was affable, kind, extremely generous and charitable, but at the same time, not mature at all. He constantly lied and deceived me, and later returned feeling sorry, like a boy caught in mischief, asking to be forgiven one more time, and then we would start all over again. Thus, the pattern of much of Schindler's life, the drinking, the affairs, and the shaky finances, were all in evidence from the early 1930s onwards. While Schindler's personal affairs were becoming rockier in the early 1930s, events were occurring beyond the borders of Czechoslovakia, which would soon have a bearing on Oskar's own life and that of his country, and then subsequently on global affairs. In neighboring Germany, the country's politics had descended into revolution and instability in the period immediately after the end of the First World War. The ruler of the German Empire, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had abdicated in the closing days of the war, bringing the empire to an end. It was replaced by a new republic. But this encountered severe unrest and revolutions in cities like Berlin and Munich, as socialists and communists attempted to claim power in the same manner that the Bolsheviks had in Russia in 1917. A counter-revolution of right-wing German nationalists rose up to meet this left-wing revolution. Many political movements emerged out of this, one of the most extreme being the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, headed by Adolf Hitler. Based on an ideology of seeking revenge for Germany's humiliation and loss of territory in the First World War, as well as a conspiracy theory that Jews and communists were seeking to destroy Germany, the Nazis soon attempted a revolt in their core base in Bavaria in November 1923. This insurrection had failed, and the stabilization of Germany's politics in the mid-1920s left the Nazis a peripheral, minor political force in southern Germany for most of the remainder of the 1920s. All of this changed, though, in late 1929. That autumn, the economic boom which had benefited Europe and the Americas for years came to a shuddering halt as the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City incurred huge losses. The Great Depression followed, and Germany was hit particularly badly on account of its huge national debt, the result of having enormous war reparations payments imposed on it by Britain and France at the end of the First World War. As ordinary Germans lost their jobs and their life savings, millions of Germans turned to more radical political groups. The Nazis suddenly surged in support, becoming the second largest political party in the country in elections in 1930, and then the largest in 1932. Although the political establishment tried to prevent their ascendancy for a time, eventually in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazis soon acquired a dictatorial grip on power, following the passage of an Enabling Act, which allowed them to rule by decree in the spring of 1933. The rise of the Nazis heralded a change in Europe's political landscape, for their political ideology included the idea of uniting all predominantly German-populated parts of Europe under the leadership of one state, a new German empire, the Third Reich. This necessarily included Austria, some parts of Western Poland, and Schindler's native Sudetenland. Schindler's personal politics is a matter of considerable dispute. Following a visit to Berlin in 1931, he expressed some sympathy for the Communist Party there. It is strange then to learn that in 1935 he became a member of the Sudeten German Party, a political party which was founded in Czechoslovakia shortly after the Nazis seized power in Germany, with the goal of fostering separatist sentiment and activity in the Sudetenland. The ultimate goal of the party was to bring the Sudetenland under German control. In assessing this and much of Schindler's activities in the mid to late 1930s, we have to remember that Schindler, like many other supporters of the Nazis, cannot have predicted the extent of the genocidal violence which they would unleash across Europe in years to come. He joined the party as a German nationalist, who, like a massive number of other ethnically German people in the Sudetenland, wanted to see the region united with Germany. Schindler also experienced a profound personal tragedy at this time, when his mother, whom he had loved dearly, died in 1935. Hans Schindler had abandoned her in her final illness, and Oskar, whose relationship with his father was always poor at best, never forgave him, although they made some partial reconciliation years later in 1941. Meanwhile, in the mid-1930s, Schindler's alcohol and money problems continued. He claimed in later years that these were the reason why he joined the Abwehr in 1936, though his wife later asserted that his first contact with the agency was through an affair with a woman who was also a member of the organization, whom he met on a business trip to Krakow in Poland. The Abwehr was the German intelligence service which had been established all the way back in 1920, during the period of the German Weimar Republic. As soon as the Nazis seized power in Germany, it was quickly turned into an instrument of foreign intelligence used to undermine Germany's neighbors, particularly Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, each of which held territory which the Nazis believed should be incorporated into a Greater Germany. Schindler's activities with the organization primarily seem to have been in the shape of recruiting others, notably people in positions of influence within business and finance, a task which he was well suited to given his years working in various business roles and his acquisition of a position with the Yaroslav Simek Bank in Prague in 1932. Recruitment was seemingly not the only task Schindler undertook for the Abwehr in the mid-1930s. He was also involved in collecting information about railways in Czechoslovakia, military installations, and the Czechoslovak army. These were all tasks which Schindler was well placed to perform. He had been in the Czechoslovak army himself just a few years earlier and had extensive contacts within it, while he traveled a lot for business, providing a cover for the collection of information and the meeting of contacts. There is also little doubt as to what the information he was gathering was for. It was for the purposes of planning a potential German invasion of the country, whether to seize the Sudetenland or all of Czechoslovakia. Moreover, he was involved increasingly in the documenting of internal conditions in Poland, a relationship with the country which would have consequences in years to come. Years later, Oskar attempted to downplay the extent of his involvement with the Abwehr, claiming he was a small player who got in over his head at the time as he sought extra money to pay off his growing debts. But others stated that Schindler was one of Germany's most senior intelligence agents in Czechoslovakia during these years. The latter assessment would seem to be corroborated by the fact that he was arrested by the Czechoslovak government for espionage in the summer of 1938 and was held for several months. As Schindler was becoming more involved with the Nazis and the Abwehr within Czechoslovakia, the Nazis in Germany were becoming more aggressive on the international stage. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end and concluded the specific peace terms with Germany, The country was prohibited from having an army of more than 100,000 men and completely barred from establishing an air force. But in 1935, the Nazi government had declared to the world its intention to breach these restrictions and began building both a new air force and recruiting upwards of 500,000 soldiers. A year later, the Rhineland region of Western Germany, which had been demilitarized under the terms of Versailles, was remilitarized. Then, as the inexorable drift towards war continued, Hitler began making it known to the European powers that he wished for Austria to unite with Germany into a Greater Germany. This had been briefly proposed following the First World War, but Britain and others had prohibited such a measure. Many within Austria were in favor of the idea, but the hardline right-wing government tried its best to oppose it. That is, until March 1938, when Vienna agreed to hold a referendum on the matter. Before it could ever be held, Hitler sent the new German army into Austria. In the days that followed, the union of the two countries, referred to as the Anschluss, was completed peacefully. This certainly did not end Nazi claims on foreign territory. As soon as Nazi flags were flying above Vienna, Hitler turned his attentions to Schindler's native Sudetenland. This region, he began arguing to the governments in London, Paris and Rome, should never have been allowed to form part of Czechoslovakia to begin with, as it was primarily comprised of German-speaking, ethnically German people. Furthermore, the Nazis soon established a new paramilitary unit known as the Sudeten-Deutsches Freikorps within Czechoslovakia. It was clear that the intention was to launch a low-level internecine war using this militia if the Sudetenland was not given to Germany. In mid-1938, when these arguments were put forward aggressively, Britain and France were in no position to press back against Hitler's demands. They had drastically scaled back their own armed forces during the interwar period and were now ill-equipped to confront Nazi aggression. Accordingly, when a conference was convened in the city of Munich in southern Germany in September 1938 to adjudicate on the issue of Schindler's homeland, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his French counterpart Edouard Daladier capitulated to Hitler's demands on the proviso that the Nazis would not seek any more territories in Europe. Thus, the Sudetenland passed into German control following the Munich Conference. The German annexation of the Sudetenland had more implications for Oskar Schindler than for most other inhabitants of this region. In the immediate term, it won him his freedom, as he was still imprisoned for his espionage activities at the time of the Munich Conference. He was released within days. Evidently, Schindler's role in the Abwehr in the mid-1930s must have been greater than he later claimed. For with the annexation of the Sudetenland in the autumn of 1938 and his release from prison, Oskar suddenly came into a significant amount of money. Just a few weeks later, he applied to join the Nazi Party, though, curiously, for an individual who had been an active Abwehr agent for years, his application was delayed for months on account of his several arrests in the 1930s for public drunkenness. It was finally accepted in the spring of 1939. By which time he and Emily had relocated to Ostrava, a city in the northeast of what is now Czechia, near the Czech-Polish border. Here, Schindler resumed his work with the Abwehr, continuing to act as a spy to undermine Czechoslovakia and Poland, though the details of his life at this time are again disputed, as Schindler was reticent about discussing his espionage work prior to the war in later years. The annexation of the Sudetenland did not pacify Hitler in the way that the British and French had hoped at Munich in 1938, an aspiration which seems retrospectively naive. No sooner had Nazi administrators moved into the Sudetenland than Hitler and his ministers in Berlin began planning for the complete annexation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This was duly undertaken in March 1939. Yet still the British and French, who were now scrambling to rearm, did not declare war. This was not to occur for several months yet. In the meantime, the Nazis also moved into parts of the Baltic states by annexing the city of Memel in what had once been the Prussian part of Germany. In the weeks and months that followed, the usual set of demands began issuing forth from Berlin concerning Germany's eastern neighbor, Poland. On this occasion, London and Paris made it clear that any breach of Polish sovereignty would constitute an act of war on Germany's part. Thus, when the Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, after a false flag operation, Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had commenced. One of its most curious outcomes would be that it would bring a businessman from the Sudetenland with a checkered personal history to international renown. As we have seen, the details of what Schindler was doing in 1939 are not entirely clear today. This is hardly surprising. As a spy, he was trying to disguise his activities. Yet while much of the finer details are not known, there's no doubting that he was involved in a significant way in gathering intelligence on Poland in the run-up to the German invasion of the country. Given this, it is also not surprising to find that he was heading for Krakow by October 1939, the city which was established as the center of the German occupation government in Poland. The country had been quickly conquered by the German Wehrmacht in a campaign which lasted little more than a month after the initial invasion. Thereafter, a huge chunk of the country was annexed to Germany, but the central and southern parts of Poland were formed into a new entity named the General Government of Poland. This included the cities of Krakow and Warsaw. The goal of the General Government was to prepare this region for a form of modern colonization, whereby the Polish population would be turned into an underclass who would serve German newcomers who moved to the region. It was here in the General Government that Schindler would spend most of the Second World War. Schindler did not arrive to Poland as a Nazi official or in his capacity as an Abwehr agent. He remained a member of the intelligence service until 1940, but after the invasion of Poland, his role within the organization was largely in abeyance. Rather, his purpose in traveling to Krakow in the days after the completion of the conquest of the country was to use his position as someone who had facilitated the German takeover of both Czechoslovakia and Poland and had influence within the Nazi regime to develop business interests in occupied Poland. He also had previous contacts and experience of Krakow, having visited the city on business in years gone by. At first, his actions in the late autumn of 1939 took the shape of operating as a black marketer and smuggler. This was a period when, as in any war or its immediate aftermath, government oversight and regulation was minimal, and people who were able to wheel and deal could acquire small fortunes during the rapid changeover of businesses and properties. Schindler was able to use his contacts and some bribes to put himself into an advantageous position in this environment and soon had accumulated a large amount of money. He was quickly able to put both his cash and his influence to more sustained use. In January 1940, he acquired the ownership of a factory in Krakow, using money provided to him by a number of Jewish financiers who were looking to disguise their wealth as much as possible at this time, before it was effectively robbed from them by the Nazi regime. At the factory, Schindler set up a business making enamelware, which he named the German Enamelware Factory. It started small, with Schindler hiring just over half a dozen Jewish workers, including a man called Abraham Bankier, who had owned the factory before Schindler purchased it. It should be noted, though, that Schindler's motive to hire Jewish workers at this point may have been more motivated by economics than ethics, as the laws which the German occupation government had put in place stipulated that Jews had to be paid less than their Polish equivalents, and Krakow was a city with a very large Jewish population. Before long, Schindler was hiring more and more Jewish workers as his operation was a major success, in large part because Schindler was able to use his influence and contacts within the Nazi regime to acquire contracts to provide his enamelware to the German army. And as it met with success, Schindler, for the first time in his life, found himself not only out of debt, but acquiring considerable wealth very quickly. When Schindler went to Poland late in 1939, he was arriving to the part of Europe which had the highest concentration of Jewish people anywhere in the continent, approximately 3.5 million altogether. This was very significant. The Nazis were rabidly anti-Semitic, and Hitler's political creed was based on the idea that a vast Jewish conspiracy was afoot to destroy Germany and the Aryan races of Europe. Accordingly, from their very first ascent to power in 1933, the regime had begun persecuting Germany's roughly 500,000 Jewish people. At the outset, this had involved the introduction of a series of laws which effectively robbed German Jews of their citizenship and persecuted them economically and socially. The idea was to apply enough pressure that they would eventually decide to leave Germany altogether. However, even before the war broke out, there was a drift towards a more extreme approach to what was deemed the Jewish question by the Nazis. In November 1938, a series of pogroms occurred in coordinated attacks across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, whereby Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes were attacked. Hundreds of Jews were killed, and tens of thousands were detained and sent to concentration camps, which had been constructed across Germany to house political prisoners and supposed enemies of the Nazi state. These attacks on Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, as it has become known, presaged events from September 1939 onwards. Once the Nazis arrived into Poland, they could no longer look to simply pressure the Reich's Jews into leaving, not when millions of Jews lived in Poland. As such, more aggressive measures were deployed from late 1939 onwards. These involved the severe disenfranchisement of the country's Jews, but also a policy of forcing Poland's Jewish people to move into ghettos in certain cities, the most notorious of which was the Warsaw Ghetto. This was effectively turned into a vast open-air prison in 1940 and 1941, one which housed nearly 400,000 Polish Jews in an area of land measuring under 4 square kilometers. At its peak, there were 8 or 9 people living on average in every room in the ghetto. Beyond these cramped conditions, life in the Warsaw Ghetto had some surface veneer of normality in the early part of the war, but in reality, the Nazis began starving the Jewish people within to death, severely restricting the food supply into this part of the city in the months that followed, so that the average Jew here was surviving on just a few hundred calories of food per day. Other plans were afoot to forcibly deport millions of Jews beyond Europe's boundaries to the Levant, or, in a particularly dystopian plan, to the East African island of Madagascar. However, these would soon give way to even more insidious plans in ways which would shape Schindler's life. In these early days of the persecution of Poland's Jews, Schindler's activities were a balance between his business activities and also humane treatment of his workers. For instance, unlike the conditions which prevailed for Jews elsewhere, Schindler invested money setting up proper kitchens and dining areas for his workers in his factories, as well as a small doctor's clinic to see to their medical needs. Despite his work for and close ties to the Nazis, Schindler was seemingly never possessed of anti-Semitic feelings of any kind. He joined the Nazis despite their racial ideology, not because of it. This favorable treatment of his Jewish workers was probably tolerated by the Nazi authorities in Krakow because they viewed Schindler as a largely harmless figure. In this respect, his heavy drinking, carousing, and womanizing behavior actually became beneficial during the war. Many Nazis, who might otherwise have scrutinized his conduct more closely, overlooked his activities. Indeed, on one occasion, when some members of the secret police, the Gestapo, called to Schindler's factory to question him about some of his workers, he appears to have gotten them drunk before sending them on their way a few hours later. Schindler's efforts to shelter Jewish workers would dramatically increase in scale from 1942 onwards. This was owing to a new development in the Nazi state's approach to the Jewish people within its borders. In the course of 1941, Hitler and his senior ministers had become increasingly confident that they would not have to answer for anything they did within their borders to any foreign power. By that time, they had conquered virtually all of Western Europe. Only Britain remained unbowed, and across the Atlantic Ocean, public opinion in the United States was against entry into the war, despite the personal desire to do so of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In this environment, when an invasion of the Soviet Union was commenced with in the summer of 1941, SS death squads were sent in behind the army to massacre hundreds of thousands of Jews in Ukraine and other regions. Back within the borders of the Third Reich, a new strategy was decided upon. This was a policy of identifying and detaining all of the Jewish people and sending them to a number of death camps in Poland such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka and Sobibor, where they would be gassed to death. The final solution, as it was termed, was decided on by the late summer of 1941 and was to be put into effect from the start of 1942. Schindler's experience of the Holocaust, which would follow from the final solution, was not through direct experience of the death camps, but rather through a smaller concentration camp called Kraków-Płaszów. Kraków-Płaszów was largely a labor camp and a holding center where large numbers of Jews from Kraków and other locations were interred for weeks or months before being sent by train to Auschwitz or one of the other death camps. Although originally a small detention center where just over 1,000 prisoners were held, it was expanded in the course of 1942 and 1943 to hold in excess of 10,000 people at any given time, and would hold nearly 20,000 prisoners at its peak. While they were kept here, people were effectively used as slave labor, and here was where Schindler came into the equation. As the war dragged on, he found it increasingly difficult to find workers for his factories, and the regime began offering him labor from Kraków-Płaszów. Schindler accepted and would spend the next few years trying to save as many people as he could. It was a constant struggle, in large part because Kraków-Płaszów was overseen by Amon Goth as commandant, an Austrian member of the Waffen-SS. Goth was a drunken sadist who often shot prisoners for little or no reason. It was this individual that Schindler would have to contend with during the years of the Holocaust. If there was a moment in Schindler's life when he moved from being a partial member of the Nazi regime who treated his workers slightly better than most others, to being somebody who was committed to saving the lives of the Jews who worked for him, then it surely occurred in the months between the summer of 1942 and the spring of 1943, as the Kraków ghetto was liquidated. The Kraków ghetto was much smaller than its equivalent in Warsaw, but it nevertheless had housed over 15,000 Jews at its height in 1941. Early in 1942, following the initiation of the final solution, orders had been sent into Poland for the liquidation of the ghettos in the months to come. That summer, the sinister process of forcibly removing thousands of Jews from the ghettos and sending them on trains to the concentration camps began. In Kraków, this was overseen from the end of May by SS Oberführer Julian Scherner. Most of it was completed within the space of a few weeks, after which only a few thousand Jews were left here as laborers. The final liquidation of the ghetto, consequently, did not occur until March 1943. It was carried out under the command of Amon Goth. During this time, several thousand of those who were left here were sent to Kraków-Płaszów, but upwards of 2,000 Jews who were deemed unfit for work were killed in the streets of the ghetto. Schindler witnessed these events and was appalled. From that point onwards, his sole objective in Poland was to protect the lives of as many Jews as possible. In the months that followed, Schindler began using his privileged status as a supplier of goods to the German army to undertake his work of saving those who would later become known as Schindler Jude or Schindler Jews. Because his factories were deemed necessary for the war effort, he was able to continue hiring Jews from Kraków-Płaszów even after the final solution was commenced with, and to have them brought to his factories, removing the danger of either being sent to the death camps or falling mercy to Amon Goth's sadistic urges. The commandant of the camp was known to wander about Kraków-Płaszów, drunk, shooting Jewish detainees on the merest pretext, so any Jew who was sent to Schindler's factories to work was removed from the danger of possible sudden death. When these workers were threatened with being sent to Auschwitz as the Holocaust intensified, Schindler would often falsify paperwork in order to make it seem that they were an essential part of his operations. For instance, housewives and lawyers were certified by Oskar as having invaluable skills as metalworkers or mechanics. When others became sick or incapacitated so that they could not work, he did his best to disguise this fact as well, as a revelation of illness and an inability to work meant almost certain death for any Jew in wartime Poland. These actions created great personal danger for Schindler. Between 1942 and 1944, he was arrested and questioned by the Gestapo on several occasions on charges of irregularities in the paperwork he was filing and of showing excessive favor to his Jewish workers. Despite this, Oskar did not desist. He even undertook a highly risky trip to the Hungarian capital Budapest in 1943 to meet two senior members of the huge 750,000-strong Hungarian Jewish community. There he provided them with extensive details about what was occurring in Poland, information which no doubt helped to save many lives when the Nazis took over direct control of Hungary in the spring of 1944 and extended the Holocaust into the country. Schindler visited Budapest on several occasions and brought back money to help finance the Jewish resistance movement within Poland. Ironically, his earlier activities with the Abwehr in the 1930s had acted as a kind of training for his later work, supporting the Jewish underground in Central Europe. As well as endangering himself, Schindler's activities by 1943 were also impoverishing him once again. The extensive contracts which Schindler had acquired in 1940 to supply the German army with enamelware had briefly made him a rich man in the early 1940s, particularly once the German invasion of the Soviet Union was entered into in 1941, and millions of German soldiers and auxiliary staff needed to be supplied with his goods. However, from 1942 onwards, Schindler began spending huge amounts of money on obtaining foodstuffs and other supplies such as medicines for the Jews who worked in his factories. The Nazi regime itself provided only a tiny amount of food for each Jewish laborer. Schindler made up the deficit. This was no mean task for a man who, at the height of his operations in 1942 and 1943, was employing over 1,500 Jewish workers in his factories in and around Krakow. Furthermore, the scale of the goods which he was obtaining could not be brought in without attracting attention, and Schindler also had to spend considerable amounts of money on bribes. He would later state that he spent a sum in excess of $1 million on these activities. This would equate to upwards of $20 million in today's money. By the time the war ended in 1945, Schindler was as broke as he had been when it started. Schindler's efforts to shield hundreds of Jewish people from the Polish camps would ultimately have been in vain if the war had continued to go in Germany's favor. Had it done so, eventually nearly all of Europe's Jews would have been killed. However, that was not the case. Initially, the war had proceeded extremely well for the Nazis, with Poland being conquered swiftly in the autumn of 1939, followed by quick invasions and occupations of Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940. That summer, a remarkably swift campaign westwards had resulted in the Low Countries and France being brought under Nazi rule. Britain, though, was another matter. Its navy and its position as an island ensured it was the one state in Europe other than the Soviet Union which could resist Nazi aggression. Thus, after a brief bombing campaign and efforts to force the British to surrender in late 1940 and early 1941, Hitler turned his attentions eastwards towards the Soviet Union, initiating an enormous land invasion of Ukraine, eastern Poland, and the Baltic states in the summer of 1941. At first, this met with major success, and the German armies were nearing Leningrad and Moscow by the autumn. But then, as the Russians began to pump enormous manpower into their war machine, the German advance stalled. The winter of 1941 was significant in more ways than one. That December, the United States also ended the war, and a new alliance of Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union now emerged. As a consequence, 1942 saw the gradual turning of the tide, as the German and Italian campaign was stymied in North Africa, and then the Russians won a major victory over the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad in southwestern Russia. The following year, the Allies went on the offensive, with the Russians beginning to push the Germans back eastwards, and the Western Allies initiating an invasion of southern Italy that summer after the victorious conclusion of the North Africa campaign came earlier that year. By that time, it was clear that the war would end in German defeat, barring the development of a weapon such as a nuclear bomb by the Germans or a major falling out amongst the Allies. Neither of these eventualities came close to occurring, and in the summer of 1944, a new Western Front was opened by the US and Britain in France. Paris and other key cities in Western Europe, such as the port of Antwerp, were soon liberated by the Allies. The Third Reich's days were now numbered, and with it the possibility increased that the Russian advance would reach into Poland before the many Jews whom Schindler was protecting were ultimately killed by the Nazi regime. As the Russians advanced westwards into Ukraine and Poland in the summer and autumn of 1944, the Nazis began the process of evacuating much of eastern and central Poland and dismantling the concentration camps there. Ultimately, Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp would not be liberated until January 1945, but by the summer of 1944, plans were underway to remove the factories from the area. Schindler was in danger of having his right to retain Jewish labor for his businesses removed altogether, as in the desperate military situation which the Nazi state found itself in by this time, enamelware was no longer considered vital to the war cause. He was advised by Mitek Pemper, a secretary of Amangots, who was himself a Polish Jew, to consider switching his business to begin making anti-tank weapons in order to be allowed to continue to shield his Jewish workers. But instead, Schindler used his contacts, his powers of persuasion, and a healthy amount of bribes to convince Goeth and many other officials in the general government, many of whom were immensely corrupt, to allow him to move his factory operations to Brunlitz in his native Czech region, and to allow him to move hundreds of his workers from Poland in the process. This was duly sanctioned in the early autumn of 1944. The move from Kraków to Brunlitz occasioned the development of Schindler's famed list, a roll of names of approximately 1,200 Jews who were to be sent to Brunlitz to work at Schindler's new factories, and thus would be spared the fate of most of those at the Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp, the great majority of whom were sent to Auschwitz and near certain death in the autumn and winter of 1944. The list was drawn up by Oskar, his wife Emily, who had joined him in Poland back in 1941, Pemper, and several others such as Abraham Bunkier and Marcel Goldberg. On it were included the names of all of Schindler's workers at his factory in Kraków, and scores more from amongst those held at Kraków-Płaszów. However, they very nearly all perished. When most of these Jews were deported from Kraków-Płaszów in the late autumn of 1944, they were mistakenly sent on different trains to Großrosen concentration camp and Auschwitz. When he learned what had occurred, Schindler quickly managed to have the bulk of them who had been sent to Großrosen released. However, it was more difficult to secure the discharge of 300 female Jews who had been sent to Auschwitz. Schindler dispatched his secretary there, where they were only discharged when he agreed to pay a bribe of 7 Reichsmarks for every worker. This is the only case that we know of where hundreds of Jews were allowed to leave Auschwitz alive, to be sent somewhere other than another concentration camp. Once the Schindler Jude had been brought to Brunlitz, the main task for Oskar and Emily was to ensure that they were not removed from there again before the war ended. Its conclusion was now looming nearer and nearer. The Western Allies crossed into Western Germany in the first weeks of 1945 and began a rapid advance into central and southern Germany in the spring. More significantly, the Soviets had begun their final drive into eastern Germany in January 1945, and by early April had surrounded Berlin, signaling the final stages of the war. Oskar and Emily Schindler continued their humanitarian efforts throughout this time. In January 1945, 120 Jewish prisoners were removed from Goletsov, a sub-camp of Auschwitz, to supply workers to Schindler's factory at Brünnlitz. These 120 men were sent westwards in a cattle wagon, with no heating in the depths of winter and without any food. When they arrived to Brünnlitz, 13 of them were dead, and another 107 were starving and frostbitten. Schindler refused to allow the Nazi commander in charge of the train to burn the bodies of the deceased, and instead had them buried with full Jewish rites near the Catholic cemetery. The 107 survivors were nursed back to health at Brünnlitz in the days and weeks that followed. The Second World War came to an end in the first days of the summer of 1945. Hitler killed himself in the Reichschancellery bunker in Berlin on the 30th of April, and when his designated successor Joseph Goebbels did the same a day later, the other heads of the government began negotiating Germany's formal surrender even as the Russians closed on the center of Berlin. As an individual who had been high up in the Abwehr in the 1930s and who had profited extensively from the occupation of Poland from the autumn of 1939 onwards, Schindler might have now been facing arrest and trial like so many others involved in the regime. However, he had been supplied with several letters from some of the Jews who had been with him for extensive periods of time, which attested to his having saved their lives. He was also gifted a gold ring inscribed with the words, "Whoever saves one life, saves the world entire," which had been fashioned using gold supplied by another Schindler Jude, Simon Jeret. With these, Oskar and Emily set off west as the war ended, hoping to avoid falling into the hands of the Soviet authorities. This they successfully did, and by the autumn of 1945, they were settled in the US zone of occupation in Bavaria in southern Germany. There, their evidence was presented to the authorities. Schindler was not to be prosecuted. The end of the war left Schindler back where he had been before it started, broke. Though he had briefly become a millionaire in relative terms in Poland in the early 1940s, he had lost everything in paying bribes and acquiring black market goods to keep the hundreds of Jews at his factories alive in the final years of the war. He once again tried his hand at various business ventures in the post-war period. But in the highly unstable economic climate of post-war Germany, these did not prosper. Much of this was owing to his old habits. Schindler never quit his excessive drinking, and his health began to deteriorate from it as he entered his 40s. Nevertheless, he was kept afloat during these years by many of the Jewish people whose lives he had saved. Many of these had left Europe to head to the nascent state of Israel in the Holy Land following the war, but they kept in touch with the Schindlers, and often he would receive some financial support either from there or from those who remained in Europe. Despite this, he and Emily decided in the late 1940s to head for Argentina in South America, a country with a large ethnically German community and also one of the largest concentrations of the Jewish diaspora in the world. Here they hoped to make a fresh start. In Argentina, Schindler learned that he was not a farmer. He tried his hand at raising chickens first and then diversified into otters for their fur. Oskar assured Emily they would soon be millionaires as the fur industry was booming. Trouble arose immediately, though, when Oskar soon realized that the otters he was raising were in fact nutrias, a similar-looking creature, but effectively a species of South American rodent. Problems mounted, and by the mid-1950s, Schindler was facing growing debts which he could not repay in Argentina. The Schindlers only survived thanks to the continuing generosity of those whom he had saved during the war and their relatives. However, Oskar and Emily's marriage did not last in Argentina. She was burned out from years of dealing with his drinking, laziness, failed business ventures, and infidelities. She possibly considered it a blessing in 1957 when he effectively abandoned her and headed back to Germany. Back in Europe, Schindler struggled on. Business ventures came and went, and in 1963 he was forced to declare bankruptcy. An initiative to have a movie of his life made, one which would be directed by the acclaimed Austrian director Fritz Lang, fell through. Though true to form, Schindler quickly spent the advance he was given on the rights to his story. In 1964, he suffered a heart attack. It was the beginning of a period of ill health which plagued him until his death in 1974 at 66 years of age. Perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, he succumbed to liver failure in the end. Schindler has been rightly celebrated and memorialized since his death. Indeed, this had begun long before he died. The Schindler Jude or Schindler Jews, those Jews who effectively survived the Holocaust as a result of his actions, supported him in his troubles after the war. Most strikingly, in 1962, a carob tree was planted in recognition of Schindler's actions at Yad Vashem, the memorial site established to the victims of the Holocaust on the Mountain of Remembrance in Jerusalem. This was placed in the Garden of the Righteous among the Nations. 4 years later, he was granted the Order of Merit by the government of West Germany. And as we have seen, there were plans during his own life, albeit abortive, to produce a motion picture detailing his actions in Poland during the Second World War. A film, as nearly all of us are aware, did eventually appear in the form of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List in 1993, which won the Academy Award for the Best Motion Picture. That same year, Oskar and Emily Schindler were named Righteous Among the Nations, a title given to non-Jews or Gentiles who risked their lives during the Second World War to save the lives of Jewish people. He was one of the few active members of the Nazi Party to have been accorded this honor. Oskar Schindler was an enigmatic character. If we were to examine his life up to the early 1940s, it doesn't read very well. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was developing a drinking problem and was arrested on numerous occasions for public disorder offenses. His marriage was troubled and he engaged in a string of affairs, one of which resulted in the birth of 2 children out of wedlock, neither of which he is reported to have looked after particularly well. Then, when the Nazis rose to power in Germany, he began acting as a spy for them in Czechoslovakia, undermining the sovereignty of his own country and helping to gather information in the late 1930s for the invasion of Poland. Although the details of his espionage activities are necessarily shadowy, there seems little doubt that he was one of the Nazi regime's most senior spies in Czechoslovakia in the mid to late 1930s. He then used his influence with the regime, following the invasion of Poland in the autumn of 1939, to acquire property in the occupied part of the country and set up his business interests there. Much of this was effectively asset stripping from a conquered people whose nation he had helped to gather intelligence on prior to the invasion. However, from the early 1940s onwards, the Oskar Schindler who is celebrated by the world emerged. As the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies became more and more severe in Poland, and he was confronted with the reality of what the regime was doing, a seed change occurred and Schindler began trying to shield his Jewish workers from the possibility of death, rather than viewing them simply as a means to enrich himself. Such was Schindler's moral awakening that in the next few years he spent virtually every penny of the considerable fortune he had accumulated in his first years in Poland, trying to save as many Jews as possible from being killed at Amongod's concentration camp at Płaszów, or being deported to one of the death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, or Sobibor. As the Holocaust and the Second World War entered its last stages, Schindler was directly responsible for saving the lives of hundreds of Jews by insisting that they were needed to run his factory at Brunlitz. Otherwise, they would surely have been sent to their deaths. His life after the war was as chaotic as it was prior to the rise of the Nazis in the early 1930s. In a sense, this symmetry perhaps reflected in some way who Schindler was. A troubled man who was capable of doing great good and who left his mark on the world through the latter. What do you think of Oskar Schindler? Do his early dealings with the Nazis in some way tarnish his legacy? Or were they simply due to his naivety about what the Nazis were capable of? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.